Hello, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12A live lesson for today. Now, today we're covering the roots of neoclassicism. It's the first lesson from Unit 3 of the course, English 12A, and basically that entire unit is about neoclassicism. So this course is just going to give us a little information about how it got started. Now, this is kind of a chunky lesson, so I'm going to try to summarize things as best as I can. But you may want to take a break in the middle of this one. I'll try to give you a little reminder to pause and take a break, okay? Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Let me move myself up in the corner here. And we are going to start on slide number 5. Now, this slide pretty much gives you an overview of the origins of neoclassicism. So it gives you all the important things you need to know. And starts off by giving you the definition of neoclassicism. It refers to the classically influenced artistic movement that began in the 17th century and dominated English and European literature through the 18th century. Now, remember, cheat sheet for centuries is you take the number they give you, subtract 1, and then add double zeros. So the 17th century, 17 minus 1 is 16, and then the double zero. So we're talking the 1600s through the 1700s, the 18th century. Now, it's said here that the neoclassical era ended in 1798 when the English poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge published lyrical ballads. And this ushered in the Romantic movement. So they pretty much just give you information about when things started and ended here. As a cultural movement, neoclassicism was a reaction to the Renaissance and the complex culture of the late 16th and early 17th century. So we're talking a reaction to the culture of the like 1500s to 1600s. So pretty much, and they give you a summary of what people thought back then. They tell you that the Renaissance philosophers agreed that humans were basically good and had boundless potential for intellectual and spiritual growth. Achievements in scholarly fields, the arts, and technology supported this view. So basically, because humans were succeeding at the time, people just sort of assumed, yeah, there are some people who are bad, but overall, humans were made to be good, and we have a lot of potential. But in the neoclassicism age, the 1700s, there were a lot of things going on that sort of countered that idea. Plots against the throne, political corruption, religious persecution, and social unrest soon clouded the era's positive outlook. So what they're telling you is part of neoclassicism is sort of pessimistic, basically. So we've got a new outlook that started showing up among people. Instead of viewing humans as inherently good, a new group claimed that humanity was inherently sinful. Now, if this sounds like something that you've encountered in religion, religion is a big part of this. The idea that humans are sinful and always are making up for deficits is kind of an important thing here. So it says here that this view meshed with the rapid growth of new Protestant sects like Puritanism. Not surprisingly, the plain style associated with these sects also influenced the emerging neoclassical writers. So basically, the Protestants are early Christians. They broke away from the Catholic Church and decided that they wanted to do things in a way that wasn't as corrupt. And because of the corruption that was especially rampant in the church, that influenced some of the view that humans were inherently sinful. Also, because they felt like things should be straightforward and direct, that's where the plain style comes from here. And they influenced writers at the time. So this combination of like negativity in terms of viewing humanity and the plain style mixed together are parts of neoclassicism. It says this style of writing, which reflected a belief in living modestly, that's what the Protestants were trying to do, favored simple words and phrasings over complex or ornate ones. Now on slide 6, there's a very convenient list that gives you characteristics and philosophy, that's the important thing, of early neoclassical writing. Now, this list is maybe like medium length, so we'll go through it. They believed humans were flawed. They valued logic, tradition, and balance. They promoted simplicity and practicality. They focused on overall design. They emphasized appropriateness and proper subject matter, and they used literal language and clear, concise wording. And I'm going to go down and go through these and break them down. Believing that humans are flawed is something that's a little self-explanatory. They thought, humans were inherently sinful, right? Valuing logic, tradition, and balance. Tradition meaning how things used to be back in the day in terms of not just how people behaved, but also how people wrote things. They also valued logic, so you couldn't just say what you felt, you had to actually provide some kind of evidence. And balance, so they wanted things to be as evenly keeled and fair from their point of view as possible. They promoted simplicity, so that's like simple living, not making things complicated, not having a bunch of expensive things, and practicality. So the things that you did should be for a reason. They should further some sort of goal. It's rarely doing things just to do them. There had to be some usefulness to what you were doing. Focusing on the overall design. That basically means focusing on the overall form of their writing and what it was saying, and also focusing on the overall design of what life is and what it's meant for philosophically. That's what that means. Overall design. What is the design of the universe? Here we have emphasize. That means that they put a lot of focus on appropriateness and proper subject matter. So things that were considered polite, things that were considered respectful. And then they use literal language and clear, concise wording. So they didn't use a lot of like metaphors or devices to make things complicated. There weren't a lot of comparisons to things. They just tried to actually say what they wanted to say in the shortest way possible. And then we get kind of like the summary of this here. The neoclassical movement spanned 2 centuries and evolved over time. So 2 centuries is like 200 years. And they also tell you that writers in the 16th and early 17th century, and they give you a name here, that's Ben Jonson. You should remember that. They did not call themselves neoclassical, but they did distinguish themselves from their peers, that's other people who were writing at the time. So they didn't have a name for themselves, but they didn't give themselves that name, the neoclassical name, but they were considered a group. So it says, for example, and this is of their peers, the metaphysical poets of the late 16th century embraced complexity, and they were sort of breaking away from the neoclassical movement. So they're just comparing and contrasting different movements that happened at the same time. Because sometimes writing movements do happen at the same time. You can't really help what's influencing people. Okay, now on slide number 8, we talk about religion being a major part of things. And I mentioned that before on the very first slide, slide number 5, but we're going to give more information about the influence of religion on things in these next couple slides. So we have here, religion is a major part of most cultures and can have far-reaching effects on their history and literature. So some of the examples that they give us is that Great Britain has a large Protestant population. So again, that's like Christianity. The country's official religion is Christianity as practiced in the Church of England or the Anglican Church. So they have their own like overarching Christian practicing church in the country. At the same time, like most democracies, religious freedom is a protected right in Britain. So they're talking about basically the difference between how things are today and what things are like in the past. They go on to say it's easy to forget that for centuries, religious suppression and persecution were common in Catholic and Protestant monarchs. So like even though things are fine today, back then in the 16th and 1700s, it was actually an issue. to be part of a certain religion if the king or queen at the time didn't support the religion you were a part of. So it says, although England's King Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church in 1533, they're giving you dates here, Protestantism did not become firmly established for many years. So what they're trying to say here is that being a Protestant was a problem for some people during some times in history. There was a lot of religious persecution, and ultimately the Protestants breaking away from the Catholic Church is part of what set things in motion for Puritans to form and to sail to the Americas to help establish things with the colonists. So all of these religious historical events have ripple effects that trickle down to today. Now they let you know that this section will focus on the religious turmoil of the 16th and 17th century. So we're going to have a whole chunk talking about how religion was a part of daily life and how it affected almost every part of British culture, and that includes literature. So they're pretty much just explaining why we're taking this detour. It's not for no reason. Religion was so important back then that we have to talk about it. Now here on slide 9, we have a timeline. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible just to hit the main points. And you should pause while I'm going through these to sort of take a moment to read and write down what you think is important, or to copy down the parts that I'm echoing. So the first event is 1517. So this is the story of the 95 Theses. They pretty much give you how it was found. A German monk named Martin Luther nailed a document now known as the 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, right? And this document listed 95 questions about the practices of the Catholic Church, including the corruptions of the clergy. Now, this was important because at the time, the printing press was a recent invention. They tell you right here. The recent invention of the printing press greatly helped the distribution of Luther's list. So the Catholic Church denounced Luther as a heretic, but because the Catholic Church was kind of running amok and getting away with a lot of things, this movement actually helped people realize that there really was an issue with the Catholic Church and how it was operating at the time. Luther really sparked the Protestant Reformation. They give you that right here. And the Protestant Reformation was a movement to reform the Catholic Church. It turns out that basically what happened is the Catholic Church didn't want to be changed. So the Protestants broke off into their own branch of Christianity. Now here's an event, the next event helped with that. So this is 1534. And this is about the English Reformation, which basically began when King Henry VIII, split from the Catholic Church in the 1530s. Now, pretty much he did this. The reason why he broke away from the church was because the church did not let him divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. He really wanted to divorce her, and the Catholic Church was like, no, we're not going to bless it. And because the church had so much influence at the time, it would have looked really awful for him to have just gone against the church to do it. So this is an issue. And it says here, he also wanted ownership of church property in England. So basically, the church had its own political sway in England and in most of Europe at the time. So they actually pretty much were like their own mini government agency. And King Henry didn't like having to have his power split. One, apart from the Parliament. Parliament was basically kind of like a Senate House equivalent sort of thing. Parliament has to back laws or policies that the king wants to establish. So his power was already split with them. And he just was having a rough time with having to split power with the Catholic Church too. So he actually just decided that the Catholic Church was too corrupt for him to stand by and watch. And he used that as the opportunity to break things off, and he formed the Church of England. Now, of course, he had the Church of England grant his divorce, right? So that he could get married to someone new. And he also took hold of that land that he wanted that belonged to the Catholic Church. But he pretty much just said, like, listen, I don't want to be affiliated with the Catholic Church anymore. So we're dethroning your power, basically. And we're going to create a new church. We're not just going to, get rid of the church because that'll make it a church in England altogether, because he knew that that would make it look like he was trying to seize power. So he basically said to everyone, listen, I'm not trying to take power, but this church is corrupt. So the least we can do is have a pure, just church that will actually stand for things that are good, instead of feeding all of the things that you all have been complaining about since Martin Luther's The 95 Theses. So what we're going to do is establish this new church, and I'm going to have to answer to them in the same way that I was answering to the Catholic Church, but we're just going to make the Catholic Church better. Now, of course, he stationed everyone that was in this new England, like the new Church of England. So, of course, even though he had to answer to them, it wasn't the same, because they were all kind of on his side. He was able to give them land and money based on taking power from the Catholic Church. And he used this opportunity to change some of the practices and doctrines of the church, especially since a lot of the Protestants that had gathered since Martin Luther's 95 Theses were unhappy with the corruption in the existing Catholic Church. So if you've ever wanted to know how Catholicism and Christianity are different, even though they're both Christian and they're under the same umbrella, this is exactly why. Because the Catholic Church was doing some corrupt stuff, and King Henry just decided, no, we're not doing that. He wanted to form a separate church that was still part of the same religion, and he wanted to make it different enough that it didn't seem like they were just copying the Catholic Church, like, because they still believed in the core tenets of Catholicism, God, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, his sacrifice, all of those things, but they didn't want to follow the exact same format as the Catholics. So he changed some of the rituals and practices. He established a new official religion in England that transferred power from the Pope to the King, basically to himself. So because he did this, he increased his political, financial, and religious control. Despite these profound changes, the church doctrine in England remained mostly the same. So he changed some of the practices, but not too many. He didn't want to rile people up and make it seem like he was being a heretic and establishing his own kind of like cult of religion. He still wanted it to be the Catholic Church. He just wanted it to be a Catholic Church that he could control. And that's what influenced some of the changes that we ended up seeing down the line. So the next event here is a span of things. It is from 1547 to 1553. So this is Edward VI, and he was one of the sons of Henry VIII. He was a king of the church from 1537 to 1553. You can see right here. He was the king of Ireland as well. Basically, he was educated by Protestant tutors, and he was a Protestant. So he was encouraged to make sweeping changes to the Anglican or the Church of England. That's basically what the Anglican Church is, just a different name for the Church of England. So King Edward encouraged the Parliament to pass laws making religious services simpler so that the common people could understand what was being said. Now, the reason why they include this is because it's important to remember, if you were a Christian under the Catholic Church, all of the sermons were in Latin, and Latin was something that only people who had a good education knew. And part of the reason behind the corruption in the Catholic churches, basically, people would only translate things when it was convenient for them. Sometimes when they did translate things, the idea was just to translate enough for people to come to the Catholic Church for help, basically. But after the printing press, people wrote a version of the Bible in English so that everyone could read, and you wouldn't have to rely on the Catholic Church for translations. So they couldn't farm money from you for pardons or collect taxes for church activities and say that it's because of what's in the Bible. Basically, it put the interpretation of the Bible in the hands of the people instead of just the clergy, people who worked in churches. And King Edward pushed that forward by working with Parliament to pass laws to make the services simpler and mandate that they be done in English so that the everyday person could understand them. It really doesn't make sense that people in a country can't understand their own religion and the text of what they say, to be honest. And that's part of what led people to believe that the Catholic Church was corrupt, because who withholds knowledge like that if they're not doing something shady? Now, in addition, one of the important things that changed was that Anglican priests were allowed to marry. So that's one of the big differences. If you are a Christian and you are a deacon or a bishop or a reverend, you can actually get married and have a family. When you are higher up in the Catholic Church, you're expected to devote your partnership to God. And that's how we get nunneries and things like that. So that was one of the big differences that King Edward pushed. So hopefully you can see kind of the path that we're going here in terms of Christians breaking off from the Catholic Church to become Protestants. So it says here, the king adopted Protestant doctrine, but preserved the rituals and structure of Catholicism. And by this, we mean that people still meet in churches. We still have sermons and lessons and things like that. But some of the rituals that happen within those meetings are just very different. And then they make a note here, at the same time, the power of the Pope in Catholicism was on the decline in England and other parts of Europe. So the corruption of the church wasn't just affecting the church in England, it was affecting how people viewed the church in other places as well. Now, this next event is in 1553. This is Mary the First coming to the throne, and she was kind of controversial. So pretty much, she was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, and she was Edward VI's sister. But she brought sweeping change, it says here. She was the Queen of England for just a few years, maybe like 5 years. So from July 1553 to 1558. But the issue here is, unlike her father, Mary never gave up Catholicism. So after she was crowned, she married a Catholic prince from Spain. And that complicated things because she reconciled, that means she made up with, said she was sorry, take me back, the Pope. And she basically was like, yeah, we're going to change all the rules back so that we're all Catholic. Are you cool with that? Are you guys cool with that? And it says this action caused panic among many English citizens, especially because a lot of them had converted to Protestantism. They didn't want to be a part of the Catholic Church because they knew how corrupt it was and how difficult it was for the people of England to participate in it and not be swindled by it. But when you make or change the official religion of a country, at this time, it basically meant that if you weren't following the country religion, you could have your stuff taken, you could have your land forfeited, you could even be, like told to just leave the country altogether and abandon like your family and all of your loved ones and belongings. So a lot of people were panicked about this. And for good reason. It says here, though she reigned for only 5 years, Mary the First had almost 300 Protestants burned at the stake and sent another 800 into exile. And see, this is part of why studying the history of how religion affected things is actually important. In this day and age, it doesn't really matter what religion you are if you're in a developed democratic country. Usually people can practice freedom of religion in those countries. But here, you definitely can't. If you don't follow the religion that the crown follows, then some bad things are going to happen to you. And that's really rough because religion is actually about faith. It's not something that you can just switch at a whim. If you truly in your heart believe in a specific religion, you wouldn't abandon it just because a king or a queen tells you, no, we've decided that's not true. We want to go buy something else. So it put a lot of people in a hardship. It says her allegiance to Catholicism inspired her to start many social reforms, but they were unsuccessful. So basically, the English people were kind of shifting more towards Protestantism, and they just weren't having it. They were not having her changes. Okay, now we've gotten to the reign of Elizabeth I. So she reigned over England and Ireland from 1533 to 1603. And pretty much her 45-year reign is considered one of the most glorious periods in English history, the Elizabethan period. And a lot of notable writers flourished or grew during that campaign, during her reign. And she pretty much secured the Church of England. So she reverted things back from what her sister was doing, her half sister, and was just like, no, this doesn't make any sense. So no thanks to Catholicism. We're going back to the Church of England. So you can imagine like how this flip-flopping must have had people in a panic. If you're a Catholic and after, Mary died, you're like, oh no, what's going to happen? And then this second queen shows up and she's like, yeah, so it's a no. It's a no to Catholicism. When it doesn't matter what side you're on, you're still on pins and needles because you don't know when someone takes the throne what religion they're going to be a part of. And furthermore, you don't know how she's actually going to deal with people who are not the same religion as the national one. In Elizabeth's case, people were lucky. She sought to create a compromise between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So she tried to, create a bridge in some areas. It says, however, both Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants, so if you weren't from England and you were a Protestant, they were often persecuted. So basically, she didn't really stop anyone from persecuting them, so basically she let people get away with hate crimes and things like that. And she was like, okay, I'm neutral on it. It is what it is. It doesn't have anything to do with me. Let's see here. And this very last one, we've got Puritanism takes root. Many in England followed their leaders from Anglican to Catholicism and back again to avoid being persecuted because they didn't want to die. However, a group of devout Protestants maintained that their beliefs, despite persecution, and that group felt like the English monarchs didn't do enough. At the same time, they felt like the Church of England could be salvaged, basically. So they pretty much said, you're not going hard enough on these Catholics. We're going to need you to do a little more, please. Because this is the source of our grief. They're all very corrupt. And instead of just letting things be neutral and not stopping anyone, you need to get rid of them now. So obviously, this was a group of extremists. They wanted to get rid of people. They wanted to purify the religion. And because of this belief, that group of radical Protestants became known as the Puritans. So that's where the Puritans came from. They wanted to purify the Church of England and force people to go so hard for Protestantism that they just hated the Catholic Church and wanted to run them out. So the central belief of Puritanism was God's supreme authority over human affairs and the church as expressed in the Bible. Alrighty, that's the timeline. We were able to go over that fairly quickly. So that's pretty awesome. Okay, so slide 10 is about Puritanism. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. There's a lot of information here, but I'm going to, if you've been here with me for these few minutes, take a breath, pause the video, have a glass of water, and then we'll go through Puritanism and then deal with the reading selections a little later. Okay. All right, if you're back from your break, let's keep it moving. So the important points here, devout Protestants were unhappy with Edward VI's half-hearted and inadequate efforts to free the Anglican Church from its Catholic roots. So basically, they had high hopes for Queen Elizabeth since she came after and thought that she would radically change things, but they later rejected her moderate beliefs because remember, she wasn't as hard on the Catholics and tried to like bridge things. They pretty much wanted to get rid of the Anglican Church, the Anglican Church's traditional Catholic trappings. So they wanted it to look completely different from Catholicism. They didn't want any roots or connections. They disproved of any rituals or practices that were not found in the Bible. So any of like the masses, the prayers and stuff, they didn't want any of that. They were like, we just want literally what's in the Bible. We want to purify things so that only what's in the Bible is important. And since people had the Bible in English now, they knew what was in it and could actually read and sort of push for that. So again, because they wanted to purify the church of these traditions, they became known as Puritans. And Puritans were among many persecuted religious groups during Elizabeth's reign, because remember, she was very neutral and relaxed on that. Now, in the late 16th and 17th centuries, Puritans left England for Holland, which is known for its religious tolerance. They tried to basically get out and find other places to live. And as we all know, in terms of American history, in 1620, a small group of Puritans made the difficult trip to the American colonies in New England because they wanted to have religious persecution there. So this is the full story behind that. They were being persecuted mostly because of their extreme views and how they were pretty much calling all the other Christians fake Christians for not wanting to completely get rid of and murder and outlaw the Catholics. People were like, that's crazy. You're doing a lot. You guys are being very extra. So we don't want you here. You're making things harder. And a lot of people persecuted them. And of course, you had the Catholics who fought back because they were like, no, you're not getting rid of us. Our religion is valid and yours is the fake one. Like, your king made it just so that he could get divorced. So like, no. And the results of that is, between all of the infighting that happened in the country, the Puritans left to go to the colonies. And that's how they got established there. So basically, even after they left, Puritanism gained popularity in England. And partially it was because it rejected the wealth, power, and authority of Catholicism and the Church of England. So they basically tried to strip themselves of the power that they thought was corrupting the different religions. So it says the Puritans did not trust the nobility or its political view of religion, and rejected the religious and royalist traditions. So they basically pointed out that, like, having another church ran by a king who just wanted power is still just as corrupt as the Catholic Church. So even though people wanted peace and they ran the Puritans out of England up to a certain point, people did come around and understand that they not necessarily were right, but that they had a valid point. So it says members of the middle class liked the Puritan emphasis on equality in God's eyes, and for that reason, they flocked to the new sect. By the 1660s, Puritanism was widely practiced in southern and eastern England. Now on slide 11 here, it says here that Puritans adopted the basic principles of Calvinism, which is a Protestant movement established by the French minister John Calvin during the Reformation. So we're getting more information about the Puritans here and what they believed in. One of Calvin's central beliefs was predestination, and that means that God's will alone determines if a person is destined for heaven or hell. So basically, they believed that there wasn't anything that you could do that would change a person's destiny. If God made it so that your fate was to go to hell, you can't change that. That's pretty much what they believed. Now, this concept is, if you're a modern Christian today, you know that this concept is like not it. The entire point of the sacrifice of Jesus in that story is to show that people are inherently good and that they can become better. And they believed in free will, which was the idea that you had a hand in deciding if you went to heaven or hell based on your actions, pretty much. But Puritans rejected the idea of free will. And they also believed in the concept of original sin, which we, Christians do, meaning that humans are flawed, sinful beings that can only be saved through the grace of God. So they did believe in that, but they also felt like if it was your destiny to go to hell, then it didn't matter. So they placed a lot of emphasis on faith, that God would choose them for salvation, faith in God's plans, and faith in their way of life. So that chosen people rhetoric was originally from the Puritans, if you've heard that thrown around, at least so far as Christianity goes. There are chosen people listed in the Bible, in terms of like Judaism and how Jewish people interpret the Bible. But in terms of Christianity, the Puritans were very strong in pushing that idea. Alrighty. So now we're getting to the reading selections, and we actually got through this tutorial pretty quickly, so I'm not gonna complain. So this is the poet that we're getting into today. He's an Elizabethan poet, so he came up during the period of that Elizabeth reigned. He was born in England in 1572, and he lived a rags to riches life that was pretty rare during his time. His father died before his birth, and they pretty much give you a little background about how he was educated, and but he basically lacked the money to continue going to school, and ended up getting honorary degrees, but that didn't really help him in terms of finding work. He worked doing labor like his stepfather for a while, but decided he didn't want to do that. And he joined the English army for quite some time. He fought in a conflict. And after his service, since he didn't have an official degree, he only had honorary degrees, he couldn't really pursue writing. So he went into theater, which was something that you needed skill to get into, but the Puritans didn't really like plays, so it was easier to get into it without a stronger education. It says here that Johnson's acting years were rowdy. He was jailed for his part in a slanderous play, and later he was almost hanged for killing a fellow author in a duel. He appeared in many of William Shakespeare's plays and was known as much for his acting as his wild lifestyle. And eventually he wrote his own theatrical material. Let's see. So on slide 15, we get a little more information. Johnson was identified as a suspect in the gunpowder plot. This is more about his life in 1605. So this was the assassination plot for Parliament that's covered in like V for Vendetta, if you've ever seen that film. If you haven't, basically, it was a plot to get a bunch of gunpowder kegs, hide them beneath the Parliament building while they were meeting to figure out what they were going to do about King James. And basically it failed. Someone was given a warning because they were a Catholic in Parliament, and one of the person planning the assassination was a fellow Catholic. So they basically sent this person a letter and was like, yeah, you might not want to go to work this day. So he actually just reported that and had someone search the basement, and they ended up finding Guy Fawkes with all of the Guy Fawkes is the main character from V for Vendetta, but he's also just the man who was down there with the powder kegs, and he was gonna pretty much sacrifice himself for the cause of assassinating Parliament. So Johnson was identified as a suspect in this plot, so either organizing or being part of it directly. Earlier, Johnson had converted to Catholicism, and people knew that. So he had to prove his loyalty to King James, since they thought he was a suspect. So he agreed to serve as a royal spy, and he spent some years doing that. So he had a very interesting life. More importantly, in terms of his writing, he wrote dramas, satires, and Greek-style plays called masques. He also became a successful poet and wrote epitaphs, epigrams, elegies, odes, songs, and verse satires. So epitaphs are pretty much odes to figures. And a lot of these are just different types of poems, to be completely honest with you. A lot of these are just a lot of different types of poems, and he became influential in the literary affairs of the day. So basically, he was famous during his time for his writing, even though he was embroiled in all of these things. Let's see. It says he had almost unparalleled self-confidence. He published his collected works in 1616 and called it the works of Benjamin Jonson. And he also praised his contemporaries, so that means people who wrote at the same time as him, and that included Shakespeare. There's a quote he has about Shakespeare that says, "He is not for an age, but for all time." And considering that we read Shakespeare today, he's not completely wrong. So let's see. Slide 16. So Jonson's poetry. Ben Jonson's poems reflect the emerging neoclassical style that would soon dominate English literature, as seen in their consistency and clear, direct expression of ideas. So he looked back to the classical styles and forms of the ancient Greeks and Romans with an emphasis on balance and strong rhythmic meter, because those were considered sophisticated at the time. Now it says, at the time, Jonson's elegant and restrained work stood in contrast to metaphysical poet John Donne. So they were writing at the same time. His notorious rough line and complex metaphors. So John Donne used a lot of rough sounds, a lot of consonants, and Jonson was more smooth sound, F's and S's and M's. It says the two poems by Jonson explored in this lesson come from a section of the works of Benjamin Jonson called epigrams. The term epigram usually refers to a short, witty, and negative poem that has a surprise twist at the end. So they give you the definition right there. Jonson, however, used the term more broadly, so he didn't just translate it as that. Jonson's epigrams are concise and witty and usually don't have a negative slant, so he felt like they didn't have to be. Now it says the epigram section of Jonson's book includes short elegies, which are mournful poems that lament the dead. And one of these is On My First Son. The poem was inspired by Jonson's first son, Benjamin, who passed away in 1603 at the age of 7. So it's a quiet but powerful elegy that captures Jonson's pain over the loss of his son. So it's 3 stanzas long. They're telling you how long it is, and features rhyming couplets in iambic pentameter. So that basically means each line has 10 syllables, and the syllables are in a pattern, unstressed and then stressed. So they have kind of like a rhythm that goes bum, 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 bum. Iambic pentameter, the penta and pentameter means 5. So that bum, bum pattern, in terms of the words he picks, repeats 5 times. That's the cheat sheet for trying to understand what iambic pentameter is. So go ahead and take a moment to read this, and then meet me back on the next slide. Alrighty, we are on slide 17. Here is basically the analysis. Now, as you know, I don't go over the readings. The readings usually take more time to go through. If you need help with understanding the reading, then you can schedule a tutoring session. I would consider also just going through this section of the video and then going back to read to see if this helps you make more sense of it. Now, the first thing they tell you is that On My First Son is 12 lines long. It's 2 lines short of a sonnet. Now, as in a sonnet, he introduces a problem at the beginning in line 2, and scholars have 2 differing interpretations of the poem. They think that it is an incomplete sonnet. Some scholars think the last lines of the poem don't offer a solution to the problem that Jonson presents. Other scholars think that the last line does contain a solution. And that theory draws on the first stanza, where Jonson assumes the blame for his son's death. He believes that he may have loved his son too much to be able to survive his loss. And in the last line, he just states that he'll never love anything as much again. So the solution to the problem, that is the solution to the problem of loving his son too much, basically. But there are different ways to interpret that. Although this poem is short and seems simple, it's deceptive in its simplicity. Rhyming couplets, so that means every 2 lines rhyme, provide a strong rhythm that's usually associated with more upbeat topics. So he did this on purpose to make it have a more upbeat rhythm when the topic is sad. It adds more emotional complexity to the poem, and at the same time, the structure iambic pentameter, that's the bum bum, type of rhythm with the words that repeats 5 times, it adds elegant restraint to Johnson's grief because he had to pick words that could fit within those 10 syllables per line instead of just going on about his feelings. Now, the second one here is the song To Celia. It's stylistically similar to First Son. It says it could not have a more different tone, though. So, like in both poems, the speaker directly addresses someone else. On My First Son, he was clearly talking to one specific person, and that's his son. But the song To Celia could have been written by anyone to anyone. So they don't actually tell you who Celia is. The only hint that we get is in the title. And then it says, in fact, Song of Celia is not entirely Johnson's own creation. The poem is a loose translation of 5 separate prose passages by Philostratus, who is Philostratus, who is a Greek philosopher. So it says, music that has since made Johnson's lines famous is an anonymous 18th century composer. Is by an anonymous 18th century composer. So someone composed music to this, and that made this poem even more famous. Alrighty, take a moment to read that excerpt and then come back here. Alrighty, now this is sort of the analysis here. And again, I don't go through the readings, but it might help you to hear this description and then go back to read the poem. Now it says, at first glance, the poem Song to Celia may not seem inventive. Johnson uses conventional imagery such as eyes, wine, and roses. A closer look, though, shows that Johnson uses these common images in creative ways. So consider this first stanza. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine, or leave a kiss but in the cup, and I'll not look for wine. So he's describing a deep and meaningful glance exchanged by 2 lovers. And his language is figurative instead of literal, which was characteristic of the time with the Neoclassicists. You can't drink someone with your eyes. So obviously he's trying to articulate a feeling. He's communicating a feeling. Now it says, despite the heavy figurative language, it's easy to imagine what this scene might look like. So it's direct in that you can picture it easily. And it says, it's evident from the first stanza that Johnson uses a lot of sensory imagery in this short poem. In just 16 lines, he evokes each of the senses. So he describes how things smell, taste, sound, how they hear, what they look like. And those details help bring the poem to life. Okay, so we have one more author here. This is John Bunyan. And it says here that his life is just as remarkable as Johnson's. Nothing about Bunyan's childhood suggests that he would become a world famous writer and preacher. So he was born in 1928 to a poor metal worker, and he didn't receive a lot of schooling, same as John Bunyan, but he had same as Johnson, but he had less education than Johnson. He spent a lot of his childhood learning his father's trade, and he also spent time in the military. So he and Johnson have some things in common. While established Protestant sects had strict requirements for ordaining clergy, Baptists simply had to feel inspired to serve God. And that's something that's carried over to the Baptist section of Christianity today. So he became a preacher. And they give you some history about how during the 1600s, male and female preachers alike became Baptists and other new Protestant sects. So this gave opportunity for him. And pretty much he was able to write through being a part of the church. He recounts his own conversion from sinner to preacher in his 1666 autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. And then sadly for him, the Anglican Church started to crack down on non-Anglican religious sects in 1660. So unfortunately, since the Baptist faith wasn't considered part of the Anglican practice of Christianity, Bunyan was given a choice. He basically could stop preaching and renounce his faith, or he could go to jail, and he chose jail. So he served his sentence for 12 years, 1616 to 1672, and spent the time preaching to fellow prisoners. And during his second imprisonment for similar charges in 1675, he wrote the Pilgrim's Progress. So he wrote and published things even though his religious sect was being pursued aggressively. His other major works were all written after his second imprisonment. They include the second part of the Pilgrim's Progress, The Life and Death of Mr. Batman, and The Holy War. So they give you on slide 24 more information about Pilgrim's Progress. The Pilgrim's Progress is one of the most popular allegories written in the English language. So they give you the definition of allegory here. Recall that an allegory is a story within two layers of meaning. The first layer is the literal meaning, which is what's actually happening. And the second layer is the symbols that the things in the story represents. So in other words, the characters, objects, events, and settings stand for ideas or qualities that are more than just what they are in the book. So basically everything in an allegory represents something. That's important to remember. So it says, writing in a style that's modeled on the English Bible, Bunyan tells the story of a pilgrim named Christian, and already we can see the double meaning. Christian is a man's name, but it also means person who practices Christianity. So he did that on purpose to get that meaning in there. So the Pilgrim's Progress is the story about the life of Christian, who is a pilgrim in the celestial city. And it's basically the story about all of the religious journey of all Christians on the path to reaching heaven. So it says, although the Pilgrim's Progress is much less popular today than it was in the 17th century, it's the source of many terms that we use in language today. So for example, the term worldly wise comes from the character Mr. Worldly Wise. So it basically means someone who's very experienced and has seen it all. So you're wise in a way that suggests that you've seen the world, but it usually has a negative connotation. It's someone who thinks that they've seen everything. It says the name of the magazine Vanity Fair also comes from the Pilgrim's Progress. So basically in the book, Vanity Fair is a large street fair at which superficial pleasures are all sold, such as beauty and influence. And the character Christian must face this temptation during his journey. So they give you an excerpt to read from the Pilgrim's Progress, and they say, as you read, pay attention not only to the basic plot, but also to the names of the characters and the trials they face. As with any allegory, this excerpt is packed with symbolic meaning. So keep that in mind. Everything represents something in this story. All righty, let's see. All righty, that's it for this lesson. Let me go ahead and stop my share. Okay, so I know there was a lot of historical stuff in there, but it was important to understand why people were writing what they were writing at the time. Most of the information was that, and I think that the summaries and the analysis of the writing will help you. So just make sure that you pause the video. I tried to cover the major points that should be in your notes and go through the rest. And just take your time going through it. If you need help, schedule a tutoring session with myself or Miss Kathy Pahovic. If you have a quick question, you can shoot an email to the the English@ATS.edu email, and we'll get back to you ASAP. Thank you very much. And as usual, this is Miss Amber signing off. Good luck with the rest of your English class.